Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. David Bassano, Professor of History at Brookdale Community College. And today I have with me Professor Jane Scimeca, also of Brookdale Community College. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure's mine. Would you like to tell everybody about yourself?
My name is Jane Scimeca. I am a professor of history at Brookdale Community College, and I teach world history and I teach women's history.
And we're colleagues in the same office there in the palatial offices of Brookdale Community College.
On our beautiful campus in Lincroft, New Jersey.
Yes. It is a beautiful campus, it's true. Today we're getting together to discuss some U.S. women's history. This is based on I believe it was a class assignment, right, Professor Scimeca, that you were doing with students in your women's history class. Doing a little debate or a little discussion on what was more important for women's rights, women's empowerment in the United States. Was it the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving women the right to vote? Was it legalization of birth control, specifically the pill? And then I threw a monkey wrench to complicate the whole thing by saying, well, maybe it was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited both gender and racial discrimination in hiring, which would give women access to professions that they weren't allowed to enter before. So let's jump right into this. What do you think were the big effects of, let's start with the 19th Amendment, 1920?
I like to broach this with my students because I like for them to stop thinking about their education as just something for them to remember and to reproduce on a test or a paper. And by asking them this hypothetical question, what's more important to women, the right to vote or the right to safe, legal birth control? It makes the decision theirs. It makes it very personal for them. And they have to sort of weigh in their own minds the benefits of each major change in women's lives. And I always tell my students, there's no right or wrong answer to this. It's all in how you support your decision. If that is what shows me whether you learned how important both of these major 20th century events impact women's lives. Mm-hmm. And so with the 19th Amendment, of course, it's such a dramatic story. It's a dramatic story that, everybody's really in the last year has gotten a big review of, because it's been the 100th anniversary of suffrage this year, that there's been a lot of hoopla around celebrating the fact that this is the 100th anniversary that women have had the right to vote, and being that it's the election year as well, with the national election, the presidential election. I mean, people have really talked about the impact of voting on women, women as voters. Are they engaged? How do women engage as voters? And so, at the end of the day, we talk about all the sacrifices that women make. I often will quote Carrie Chapman Catt in class, and I'll say, Carrie Chapman Catt said famously after the 19th Amendment was passed that this vote has been costly. Prize it.
Right.
And I ask my students, do you vote? Are you registered? And, it's never 100%, it's never a unanimous, yes, we all vote. I mean, there are people who will not register to vote and don't see it as an important part of their lives. They don't politics for whatever reason, and they don't vote. So that begs the next question. Well, then, is voting important? Is this right to vote the most important thing in women's lives? If so many women don't register and don't vote. I mean, we do know that when women were fighting for the right to vote, they promised that the vote would make an impact on society in a variety of ways. That women were going to use their votes to clean up corruption, that they were going to introduce their maternal feminism into their political decision on for whom to vote, that they were going to vote for issues and candidates that were going to protect children, that were going to protect the family, that were going to support morality in politics rather than just money. Men understand money, women understand family. Men are the head, women are the heart, right? So that they had made all these assertions in arguing for women to get the right to vote, that women were going to use their vote differently than men were.
Okay.
Women were going to have a different approach to their political citizenship than men were. And that women were not asking for the vote for themselves, but for society at large, that they were going to kind of take care of society just like they take care of their families, you know. And so, you know, the right to vote has this significance to women as this symbolic issue. So I would say second, you know, on a secondary level, it's symbolic that women had always been viewed as in the English common law, as property, as essentially the junior partner in the household, that man was the citizen and she was sort of his covered, right? The femme couverte, she's covered under his citizenship.
Yeah.
So by recognizing women as voters, you're recognizing her individuality as a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that symbolic meaning. There's the maternal feminism of all the things that women can do with the vote. And then I would say the third thing is that it's finally breaking the male monopoly on political power. That men had monopolized political power for decades and decades. And this was the first time women were really going to be able to crack into that. So for many reasons, you could argue that women's voting rights in the 19th Amendment's passage is an extremely significant step in women's rights and having really fulfilling the promise of the country that all are created equal.
You know, it's as important as that is in kind of redefining a woman as a full citizen, a full human being in the United States. Even the suffragettes, as soon as the 19th Amendment was signed, they recognized, especially I think Alice Paul did, recognize that this is just the first step, right? So what's the first thing they do? They try to pass Equal Rights Amendment, right, immediately after suffrage, because they recognized that the vote was not enough, that it might lead to more, but you would actually have to take the political action, which is interesting.
And, you know, and also, you know, they had all this momentum.
Yes.
They had built this enormous, movement over that last decade from 1910 to 1920. They had built this incredibly large, nationwide movement. And they had all the boots on the ground already. People were already energized, and they had the organizational structure in place to do it. And as soon as the goal was accomplished, the movement really fractures.
Yeah. And
Alice Paul understood, and she goes to law school after that. She goes to law school because she realizes that the future, the next goal is going to be these legal challenges, that she had to get a law degree in order to participate.
Right.
And but so many women in the movement were really not in agreement with her about legal equality. They were involved for maternal feminism, and they wanted legislation that was going to treat women differently than men. Like the Shepherd-Towner Act. The Shepherd-Towner Act, which was like one of the big first things that women insist on as voters, which was federal programs for maternal health and for, children's welfare, right? To, help babies and infants, and, that they wanted to pass legislation that was going to protect women workers, that women workers couldn't work after 10 o'clock at night or something, right? That women had to be protected. They were like a separate class.
Right.
And Alice Paul was like, no, I think that's not what we want. We want women and men to be equal in the eyes of the law. And so that fracturing that happens immediately is really due to these conflicting views of feminism.
Yeah. Yeah, and that fracturing too, if you look at social movements at large, sometimes social movements fragment because they lose, and sometimes they fragment because they win. You know, the civil rights movement in the 60s, when, you know, after the 64, 65, when the legislation was signed, began to fragment in a similar way. And one of the big what ifs of American history, I think, was, okay, what if they had signed ERA in 1921, 1922? What would that have looked like? But, you know, this long pause between the first and second waves of feminism, which it doesn't mean that nothing was happening. I mean, Margaret Sanger was working her tail off in this period. Why that long pause, do you suppose, between the 19th Amendment and the second wave of feminism?
I think that the one of the you know, the probably easiest answer to that question is that during the 1930s and the 1940s, there's depression and war, and that those national crises really supersede feminism. You know, nobody's really interested in feminist causes when people are starving in the country, and that the demand that everybody, you know, pull together for the war effort, the mobilization of women for the war effort, and the suffering during the Great Depression really put feminism on the back burner.
Okay.
And I would say that that's really the probably the most direct answer to, you know, to where does it go. I mean, I think that there certainly were still women like Alice Paul who were still interested in working, and you do have the movement of women into more government roles, that women who were reformers, for example, women in reform and who had made careers in reform movements as, for lack of a better expression, like, you know, volunteering, were able to move into more official government agencies. You know, people like Florence Kelley, for example. Like, you know, there are a lot of women that are kind of forgotten in history who are really important in terms of their work in reform and in government action. Like, obviously most of us know who Frances Perkins is. Sure. She was Secretary of Labor, but she had been working for decades in the legislation, writing labor legislation, writing new rules to protect workers. And then ultimately she is the first female Secretary of Labor in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration. But that's not to say she hadn't already been an advocate and working in reform for many decades. So I think that a lot of the women who were supportive of suffrage, once suffrage is accomplished in 1920, they parlay that into careers in different reform organizations, working in, kind of like youth, family issues and labor issues.
Okay. When we do, I get from Betty Friedan, right, in Feminine Mystique, that World War II is this, it's interesting, like it's a turning point and yet it's not. It has this empowerment of women realizing what it's like to, work outside the home, work outside the home other than being a nurse or a teacher, the traditional women's jobs, to make their own money, to run the household when the man has been drafted and is off to war. And then you get this experience of literally being kicked off your job because the men come home from the war and they had this empowerment experience, and then it all just seems to fall apart, but yet women not forgetting what that was like. and maybe why that was such a spur to the second wave of feminism, that way that experience had been. But that's bringing, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that certainly the impact on women in World War II on the women's movement and the second wave of women's feminist revival of feminism in 1960s is not easy to assess. I would say that there are certainly things that I like to throw out there as possible explanations. For example, the women who are mobilized for World War II are very important to the success of the United States in winning World War II. Their mobilization, the millions of women who go take jobs who had never traditionally worked. While there has always been a large part of the workers that are women, about 25% of the population of women, women made up about 25% of the workers in the country. But World War II really expands that. And for the first time, you have really married women working, women who had children working. Those women were not traditionally parts of, the workers. And also, women who were disabled even went into the workforce. So we see that the mass mobilization of women, I think, is a big change, and that we've never seen. And those women, most of those women want to continue working, and many of them do after the war is over. So it changes the culture of the workforce. I would also say that, it's an extremely patriotic time. World War II was extremely patriotic, and women really felt a strong connection in their patriotic duty. I had a really great conversation with my class last week about this, in that we looked at the image of Rosie the Riveter from the Saturday Evening Post. And I said, all right, so what does this say about femininity? Rosie with her sandwich and her dirty face on, she's got makeup on, and she's feminine, and but she's very, very brawny. She's extremely physically turned out, physically strong, manly almost. And so what does that say about the changing image of women? That women are strong, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing for the country. And we compared it to the Republican mother of the American Revolution and the women of the American Revolution, the same kind of, these threads that get tied through during wartime. And you realize that it's the women of the 1960s who are enthusiastic about joining the women's movement are the daughters of these women. Yeah. So it's the daughters of the Rosie the Riveters. It's the daughters of the women who hold the families together during the Great Depression, and who scrimp and save, and really take these important roles in mobilization during the war and the Depression, that I think are certainly empowered to want something for themselves after the war is over. And that's what's really different about the 60s women's movement, that the second wave is, for the first time, we see feminism proclaiming that women deserve equality because they want something for themselves. And that's also why they're criticized. Yeah.
Selfishness, or not following the traditional feminine role of support. I remember seeing posters from World War II that were trying to encourage women to go and work in the factories. Like, the women, apparently there was some resistance, well, this isn't our role. And the posters are saying, has a woman with her arms around her man in a uniform, and she's wearing the work clothes for the factory. And she's saying, I'm doing my part. I'm proud to fight in this war. And they're trying to encourage the women, to kind of break the old rules and actually go into the factories. Apparently, well, now that the government needs them, we're going to try to encourage them to go and do this. and then of course take it all away when we don't need them in the factories anymore. The emergency is over. But
and it was really a fear that women weren't going to give up these jobs because they were very worried about another recession or depression after the war. After World War I, there was this terrible recession that led to the depression, and that they were terrified that there would be another economic collapse, and that this was, really dependent. And women become a very big part of this equation, not only leaving the factory jobs, but also consumerism becomes a very important civic responsibility that women had to uphold, that they needed to kind of let go of their Depression era frugality and purchase consumer goods as fast and as possible, and buy that refrigerator, buy that car, buy that, buy clothes, buy goods for your house. And that women's patriotic duty shifts from being in the workforce in heavy industry to being the consumer.
That's fascinating. I mean, you've got to have somebody buying if you're going to sell now, don't you? Yeah. Well, there's children of the World War II generation. Now, when we get up into the 60s, the second wave of feminism, one of their accomplishments was legalization, or at least, legalization of the pill in the United States, which was 65, if I remember correctly. What was the effect of that on American women?
Well, I think the way to understand that is to go back a little further. The story of the pill really goes back into the 1800s, because the problems with birth control were many. First of all, birth control was illegal in that information was classified as pornography.
Mm-hmm.
So nobody was allowed to mail any information about birth control because it was classified the same as porn.
Mm-hmm.
And this was passed in the Comstock laws in the 1870s in New York, and was the Comstock laws were duplicated in all the other states as well. And this is not to say there wasn't any birth control available. There was. There were things in the back shelf of the pharmacies, but you had to know how to use them. So there were things like cervical caps, like contraceptive sponges, like diaphragms, like condoms. Those things were all there. Also different kinds of contraceptive powders that would be used in douching after intimate relations took place. So the products were there, but nobody really talked about it because nobody really had any information. If you had the information, perhaps you would whisper it to each other. But the products were there, but most people didn't know how to use them, and it was so forbidden and taboo to do so. So there's the legal problems, and then there's also the science. And we don't realize it now, but it's not really until after 1920s that science even understands enough about the human reproductive system and biology. They didn't even know what hormones were. So, we all know that what is the birth control pill, right? The birth control pill is hormones. Mm-hmm. So if you don't know what hormones are, if biologists don't know what hormones are, then how are you going to have birth control based on hormones, right? So right. Science had to catch up. So we start to see in the 20s and the 1920s and 30s, different scientists really become familiar with the human reproductive system and what hormones are, discovering estrogen, progesterone, and the like, and what the role that they each play in reproduction. And what a lot of the research the goals of the research studies were really to study the opposite, meaning they were studying hormones in order to solve the problems of infertility.
Okay.
Okay, so if somebody was infertile, the scientists and the medical profession was trying to study and understand what made somebody infertile. Well, if you discover what makes somebody infertile, you inadvertently also understand what makes somebody fertile.
Right.
So those two things are really interconnected. So they start to do, there's more radical research going on in the 1920s and 1930s where they begin to understand a little bit more about the reproductive cycle and when women are fertile and when they are not fertile throughout the month. And so the medical profession starts to catch up. The other thing that happens is the fact that the First World War happens. And during the First World War, the United States sent troops to fight in Europe, and they were really worried that the young men that they sent to France were going to come home with sexually transmitted disease.
Right.
So they had to give them two things. They had to give them condoms. They had to give them information. And so they ultimately provide the troops with condoms. And what's the long-term result of this? That men become familiar with, and it becomes acceptable to them to use condoms when in the rest of their lives, right? So they kind of start to make it socially acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And the information that they give them, they plagiarize from Margaret Sanger.
No kidding.
So Margaret Sanger had been challenging, kind of engaging in direct action.
Yeah.
She had, from the time she was a young public health nurse, a visiting nurse in New York in the Lower East Side, working with poor families, she had become committed to the cause of birth control, which she actually invents that term, by the way. She's the one who invents the term birth control. And she starts writing articles and newsletters on family planning that explain. So she's deliberately breaking the Comstock laws by disseminating this information in her newsletters. And she writes articles like what every girl should know, that kind of thing. Well, what did the U.S. government do when they send the soldiers to fight in World War I is they plagiarize parts of Margaret Sanger's writing.
Her anarchist newspaper that she was sending around, right?
Yeah. And, the problem with Margaret Sanger is that she had, for so long, politically, she had lived in the left, right? She had lived in the labor movement. She had, Emma Goldman was a very close friend of hers. So, she had really in the early part of her career, really was in that left-wing political world. Mm-hmm. But she, in order to become really successful and achieve her goals of her movement, she had to move away from that. She had to become more mainstream. If she wanted people to accept birth control as a part of family life, she had to become more towards the middle. And so the soldiers go to World War I with the condoms, with Margaret Sanger's literature. And so it starts to become more popular and it becomes more socially acceptable.
Okay.
In the 1930s is the Great Depression. And people are more desperate than ever to prevent pregnancy when you cannot feed the children you already have. Mm. And so this became even more out in the open. People were much more open and looking for birth control information. I also think that there's an impact of Sigmund Freud here. That there's a new psychology in the world that begins to accept sexuality as a normal part of being a human being. That it's not something that should be shunned or dirty or seamy and that nobody should talk about such things. But Freud is saying, hey, part of being a human being is your sexuality. It's sort of what makes you who us, who we are. It's acceptable part of our world and our lives as people. Mm. So I think there's that growing acceptance too. So when we think of the 60s, we often think of the sexual revolution of the 60s, but there was a sexual revolution, another one, an earlier one in the early part of the 20th century, that really, where people started to be more accepting of their sexualities and having more partners and things like that.
And the Kinsey report and all that coming out. And
oh, right.
Yeah.
So, in the 1950s, so getting to your point about the pill, I think all that has to come together. So in order for the pill to happen, you had to have the changes in the law. You had to have changes in science, medical science. And you also had to have growing public acceptance of using birth control in a marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens in the 1940s is that Margaret Sanger had always had a friendship with a woman named Catherine McCormick.
Mm-hmm.
Catherine McCormick was she was actually from a very elite family, and she went to MIT herself. She's like one of the first women to graduate from MIT, and she married a man who was the heir to the McCormick tractor fortune.
Hmm.
So, two well-heeled elite American families joined together, and very early in their marriage, her husband exhibited schizophrenia, and so in his 20s his schizophrenia becomes apparent, and she decides that she doesn't want to have any children because she believed, like most people, in eugenics. So she believed that if she had children, they might inherit schizophrenia. So she becomes interested in the birth control movement for that reason. So she becomes sort of a colleague and a friend of Margaret Sanger's. And so when Margaret Sanger in the 1950s decides that she's going to fulfill really one of her lifelong goals, which was to have a birth control device that was private, that women could use and control, and that would interrupt lovemaking.
Yeah.
Right. So it wasn't like anything you had to interrupt and to use. So the pill was just taken privately every day. That was always her dream. So she goes to Catherine McCormick and she asks Catherine McCormick to fund the research for the pill. And Catherine McCormick just writes the check out and gives it to her. And so Margaret Sanger is able to use Catherine McCormick's funding to fund the research that she has Dr. Gregory Pincus and Dr. John Rock, both working on developing the birth control pill. So throughout the 1950s, they develop it, and it's actually approved by the FDA under the brand name Enovid.
Mm-hmm.
And Enovid was not approved as a contraceptive. It was actually approved as a drug to prevent menstrual cramping.
Right.
With this side effect. So it's actually approved in 1960 under the brand name Enovid. But again, there were still legal barriers to the pill. And the legal barriers were that, could doctors give information to married couples, to married women in order to help them with their family planning. So what happens is Enovid is approved, and its off-label side effect was contraception. Mm. So what ends up happening is that once this becomes widely known, women start going to their doctors complaining of terrible menstrual cramping, and they begin to take the pill in asking for this other, for this reason that they claim that they have these terrible menstrual cramps and they have to have the pill. Mm-hmm. So there were continuing legal hurdles. And so it's really not until 1965 where the Supreme Court rules on Griswold versus Connecticut that it was legal for doctors to give married women birth control information. And it's not until 1973 that the Supreme Court rules that it's legal for doctors to give birth control information to single women. So the story of the pill really, it spans legal history, it spans social change, it spans medical science, and it's all really it all really radiates from this one person, Margaret Sanger, who really shepherds it all the way from the 1800s all the way through to the approval of the pill by the FDA.
I mean, her story is incredible. She gave her entire life to that. At one point, having to go into exile in England because didn't she try to distribute some diaphragm she had gotten from the Netherlands or something, and then she was charged with assassination? Is incredible. She had to go hide out in England until they dropped the charges.
Yeah, well, she opens the first birth control clinic in the United States in 1916, which is really, it was a strike, which was really a genius on her part, because she had to continually keep it in public eye. And she's trying to bring public attention to the issue. But still to this day, I would say that people are still continually squeamish about the topic.
Sure.
And even now, 2020, people are still squeamish about talking about these matters. And she becomes really the big villain of the Catholic Church mercilessly attacks her. And she is still attacked, even over 50 years after her death. She died in 1966. And just last summer, her name was taken off a birth control, a building in New York dedicated to family planning. And it's because people associate her with eugenics.
Yes.
She was, it was race suicide, and was racist and things. And she was like a Nazi, whatever. And, which is a total misread of her life and her work and her dedication to this at a time when people really were not behind it. And even as a coda to that, I mentioned Carrie Chapman Catt earlier when we talked about the suffrage movement. Well, Carrie Chapman Catt completely rebuffed the birth control movement. That when she had, a chance to work with Margaret Sanger on this issue, she said, "Your movement is too sordid for us." Carrie Catt, these are nice middle-class ladies who don't talk about such things.
Right.
And she believed in this idea that, women were more moral and pure than men were, and that women had a certain authority in the bedroom as a result. And if women were to have birth control, well, then she would lose that authority. She would lose the ability to regulate how much sex they were having in a marriage. And so we see that even, among people that we think are these, forward-looking activists, birth control was even too far for them.
Yeah.
So, I think that, and I think it's a real shame that Margaret Sanger is still vilified by many people, because what she does for women, I would argue, is equally as important than the political right of the vote, because more than 80% of women after 1945 say that they've used birth control at some point in their lives. Mm. And I would say, if we come up a little sooner, up to our time a little closer, I would say it's over 90% of women have used birth control at some point in their lives for whatever reason. And it's So how many people can we say in history have touched that many women's lives?
Yeah. Yeah, she really had a
Through her
phenomenal
efforts.
life. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And, there's so many interesting, she is just a fascinating individual. Nobody in history is perfect. That's not what historians are about, looking for perfection, right? But that she commits herself to this one cause through her entire life. She works her entire life for it.
Yeah.
And she has, she's not easy to work with. She, fights with people and, she has her disagreements, but she is also, she is able to make the legal change, the social change, and the medical change that was needed in order to accomplish the goal. And so now, we come beyond the pill. There are so many even newer medical breakthroughs that women today are able to take advantage of, different kinds of IUDs and the shot, that people take a shot every 3 months, and it's the hormones, right? It's all about understanding the way that the hormones interact in the body.
And the effect on women's lives of being able to do family planning. Still to this day, the woman is typically bearing most responsibility for raising the children. And so a woman she can take time out, maybe delay motherhood and focus instead on her career or getting an education and then starting a career. And then maybe if you want to, then take some time to have kids. I mean, the freedom, the power that it gives women over their own lives. I mean, you're right. It's perhaps greater than the effect of the 19th Amendment. Yeah.
It is. It's a very interesting argument because, women, before they had access to safe and legal birth control, could be pregnant almost every year from the time that they married until they enter menopause.
Yeah.
And that's the case. That was the case with my own grandmother. My mother's one of 9 children. And so my mother lands sort of in the middle of the family. And she last year or two, she looked at her own birth certificate. And she noticed on her birth certificate that they asked her mother when she was born how many pregnancies she had had. And so if my mother is the 4th out of 9, my grandmother wrote on the birth certificate that had been her 10th pregnancy. So women were also, there was an enormous health consequence to this.
Yeah.
Women who are constantly pregnant or with small children, raising children throughout over 20 years, perhaps, from if you got married when you were 18 years old, like many women did, and you were going to be spending all that time, 20 years of having children, losing children. Obviously, my mother's mother had miscarriages constantly, right? To have 9 living children and losing children. She did lose a couple of children and also having miscarriages. I mean, the toll on women's health is enormous. It's unhealthy that women, and this is something that Margaret Sanger was also personally touched by. Her mother died at 49 of tuberculosis. So that this was something that women were also, suffering from that. Women were fearful of being constantly pregnant. And the economic ramifications, that the connection to poverty. You can't raise 10 kids and have prosperity unless you are extremely wealthy.
Yeah.
So that there's the whole economic component of it as well. And I think that the acceptance, finally the medical industry, the medical profession embracing birth control as a legitimate part of your medical practice.
Yeah.
makes it a certain, lends it legitimacy and acceptance. And like you said, it has given women after 1960, the generation that grew up after 1960, it has been afforded the ability to have freedom, the freedom to have a career, to plan a career, and to plan motherhood and raising children, and that those can be two distinct chapters of a woman's life.
Yeah. Now, kind of piggybacking on the economics that you brought up, Civil Rights Act, 1964, and we usually think of this as coming out of the civil rights movement through the 50s and 60s, which it did, but I guess it was because of the rise of the second wave of feminism in the early 60s is when they come to sign the legislation to grant freedom from discrimination in hiring on the basis of race. They also add you cannot discriminate in hiring on the basis of gender. And I would argue that that's at least as important as the right to contraception in terms of a woman's her life, her economics, right, and how she wants to live her life, because you cannot, after this, legally just say, no, we don't have females CEOs, or no, we're simply not going to hire you because you're a woman. You know, it becomes illegal, and it opens up higher paying jobs, for one thing, for women, granting them their own source of income. I mean, it doesn't try to stop them from high paid jobs.
Well, you know, it's interesting. The whole story behind Title VII of the Civil Rights Act has its own kind of historical mystery attached to it as well. So when the Civil Rights Act was being debated, the National Women's Party, which was Alice Paul's political party, had continued from 1923 when it was written, the RA, had continued to lobby in Washington, and they had an ally in a Virginia congressman, an elder gentleman in the Congress named Howard Smith. And so Howard Smith was an ally of Alice Paul's, but he was also a staunch segregationalist. Mm-hmm. So when the Civil Rights Act was being discussed, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act says that you cannot discriminate based on race, creed, or national origin. He's convinced by the National Women's Party to include and sex in Title VII. And it's always been one of the mysteries connected to the passage of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is, did Howard Smith support the inclusion of sex in Title VII in order to, because of his support of the National Women's Party and Alice Paul, because they had a long alliance there? Or was it because he thought it might sink the Civil Rights Act entirely? And, you know, it's one of the mysteries about it, that maybe he thought either way he would win, that he would have, you know, done something for Alice Paul, but if it sinks the whole bill, oh well.
Right.
So that's always one of the stories that comes up about the Civil Rights Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And, you know, obviously one of the things that's important about the Civil Rights Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, in terms of women in the second wave of feminism, is that it creates the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so it creates a new government arm to investigate complaints. Mm-hmm. And so even though they, I think, created it expecting that a lot of the complaints were going to be on racial grounds, most of the early complaints were about women, from women. And one of the famous early complaints was from the stewardesses, women who were the flight attendants, because flight attendants were fired when they turned 30 years old. They were considered too old to be flight attendants, that they were supposed to, be young and attractive, and they had to only be a certain weight and a certain height. And, that there were a lot of, now when we look back, a kind of ridiculous and humiliating job, requirements, right? And they had to have their hair a certain way, and their makeup had to look a certain way. And so they had to, dress a certain way. So I would say that is important. But it also kind of leads to the question of, well, then how do you really change hiring practices? Because I would also say that in addition to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is important, it was important to be able to have a way to prosecute these things, and to bring public attention and lawsuits against companies that discriminated. That I would also say equally that Title IX has also been equally as important. So Title IX outlaws federal funding for colleges that discriminate. So if you have, we mostly probably are most familiar with this in terms of sports, that if you have a male basketball team on your college campus, you have to have an equivalent female basketball team, or else you lose your federal funding. And I think that this has also had a very important impact on not just in sports, but also in professional programs. So you realize until Title IX, that law schools and medical schools and professional programs only took 5% women. And this, I think, has had as equally an important impact, because it's after Title IX, that we see colleges begin to, some of the male-only colleges, like the Ivy League schools, begin to take women. Only after Title IX.
Yeah, college cannot afford to have that money cut. So
that was a very effective stick.
Yeah.
We think about women like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who we just lost this year recently. Her impact in bringing attention to a lot of these issues. But look at her law school class. If you see her, if you watch any of the biopics about her, now there's several you could look at, and you look at women like Sandra Day O'Connor, who graduated from Stanford Law School. Neither of them could get a job. Right. So these things kind of go hand in hand, I think. The fact that you start to see criticism and legal barriers to discriminating against women. And that takes a really long time to filter through. I think that we're still sort of in this, obviously, right? We have our female vice president that's going to be inaugurated in January. So, we see that these male-dominated economic and political dominance by men in societies it's been very slow to be changed. And I think that the more women in law school, the more women in medical school, that we're starting to see parity in the professions has had equal impact. I would also say things like the Equal Pay Act, 1963, is also important. Now, the Equal Pay Act, we know there's still disparity. So some of these laws have not changed practices because it's very hard to prove.
Yes.
Things like the Equal Pay Act, which was a great symbolic gesture, and it's good that we have it, but has been very hard to enforce. How do you get the paychecks? How you know that, employee A and employee B are being paid differently and it was a discriminatory practice, right?
Proving that it was discriminatory. Yeah.
Right. And the famous case with Lily Ledbetter losing her case in the Supreme Court against Goodyear Tire is a case in point. That, her loss in the Supreme Court, and what was that, 2007, 2006? It was during the George W. Bush administration. And George W. Bush administration filed an amicus brief on behalf of Goodyear. Right? Because it's too burdensome on a corporation to pay people equally. So that we see that while things have begun to change with federal programs like Title IX, with legislation like Title VII and the Equal Pay Act, that we still see patterns of patriarchy and inequality persist from the 1960s all the way till today. So I would say that it's over a 50-year time period that the change has been quite slow. Yes.
I mean, coming back to the importance of all these different acts to try to remove discrimination, whether it's, the Civil Rights Act or Title VII, the point being, I guess, and to make sure I clarify this, for somebody to be free, really free, they need their own source of income. If you depend on somebody else, i.e. a man, let's say a woman depending on a man for his income, you can have all the political rights on paper, the right to vote that you want, but you depend on that person. Whoever has the purse strings is going to run the show. And I guess the importance of that is for a woman to have a good, independent income so she does not have to depend on the man for it, which was traditionally a way of men keeping women under control. You keep the purse strings.
Absolutely. I mean, and, when at the end of her life, when Susan B. Anthony was interviewed, and she knew she was never going to see suffrage, even though she had worked her whole life, right, for the suffrage campaign. And she was asked by a reporter, what do women want? And she's very simply said, women want to be free. Women want to have the same choices that men have, to marry or not, to not have to marry in order to live. And that the patriarchal control over women has largely been economic. Yeah. That you cannot support yourself. That if you will starve, you're going to get married instead.
If you want a roof over your head, sure.
It becomes like an issue of survival.
Yeah.
And, that marriage has become such a political issue. And, I think that we've even heard this in the, the kind of the political, dialogue over the last 10 years by conservatives, people like Marco Rubio, who believe that, women need to get married, that women are not getting married like they once did, and that this is a problem.
Right.
It's a problem because we're seeing the birth rate decline. And, he looks at it as a conservative that, women should not depend on the state, that women should get married and let you know, it's really that same English common law tradition.
Yeah.
But the word I was looking for before was like this idea that the political discourse is really still looking at this idea that males have really lost control of women, and the only way that they can sort of reassert that control is through economics.
Yes.
And, you know, we think about birth control, certainly birth control and changing sexual mores have made it more acceptable for women to have sex lives outside of marriage. And if women can earn a living without being married and survive, that also is a strike against marriage as a necessity, right? So you don't get married if you really want to. If you don't want to get married, you don't want that life, well, you have more options than ever in human history.
Yeah. And that's really the point. I mean, to close, I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, I was doing a family history of my family, and I was interviewing my great aunts on my mother's side, and you know, we're talking about her life all through the Depression, and then what that was like, and a little bit about, you know, World War II and everything. And in a pause in the conversation, she stopped, and she suddenly said, "I feel like I've lived somebody else's life." And I said, "Excuse me, what?" She said, yeah. I didn't want to get married. I didn't want to have kids. I wanted to get a job and have my own apartment and my own money and just live my own life the way I wanted to. You see, you know, this is the late 40s, and I was in this old-fashioned Catholic family. Like, that was not an option. I would have been ostracized. I couldn't have gotten a good job. My family would have ostracized me. The whole society would have ostracized me. I had to go along and do this. And
that's so sad, isn't it?
Yes. And I think what women's history is all about is so that women can live their own lives and not have to go through what my aunt did and live somebody else's life for her whole existence.
It's really true. It like comes down to, you know, Hillary Clinton's speech, you know, human rights, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights.
Yeah.
And that it's interesting, and it also takes, there's like an intermediate step there, I think, for each of us as individuals, that we have to almost have that aha moment where we recognize that we have to unlearn those pressures on ourselves. You know, we have to unlearn what the old-fashioned expectations on women are.
I mean, technically, my aunt could have gone her own way, but the difficulty involved, you know, would have been tremendous. I don't blame her in the slightest for what she did, because the deck was stacked against her, right?
Of course. And if you're not supported, if you don't feel supported, if you don't feel like you have people in your corner, if you're only going to hear criticism constantly for the rest of your life, right? You know, it's not likely you're going to be that brave.
Yeah.
You know, to take the hard road. Most people don't take the hard road.
No, it's true.
You know, and it's not until you're older, you probably look back at that and you say, you know, maybe there was like this much daylight, right? Where I could have squozen through that little bit of daylight to have the life I really, really wanted. Except that, you know, we forget what it's like sometimes, I think, to be young people and to realize that the opprobrium of your family, the opprobrium of your parents and your grandparents, how much that means to you.
Yeah, a lot for all of us.
You know, absolutely. I mean, just look at people who now come out as gay and are able, just recently in this last generation, to be who they want to be.
Yeah.
And you know, the fear of being cast out.
That's primal, you know.
It is primal.
Yeah.
It is primal, right? You know, so I agree, you know, that there's, and I think that's part of the reason why some of the women in women's history who were able to carve out a niche for themselves and avoid marriage and motherhood, who didn't really want it, are mostly women in the wealthy classes.
Right. That's a good point.
It's Jane Addams, right? Jane Addams came from this really wealthy family in Chicago, and she takes her family silver that she inherits, and she goes and she buys a whole house.
Yeah.
You know, and she, you know, and she has this, and she creates a life that there was no pattern. You know, she's not, there's no mentor. There's no, you know, she's the first, you know, there's in this generation where there's just so few women who are able to avoid the claim of a husband and motherhood and the drudgery being that, you know. And Susan B. Anthony does too. You know, she's, you know, able to, you know, kind of escape that, you know, what everybody, you know, 99.9% of all women ended up being.
Yeah. And Sanger's mission, I guess, was for all women to have that opportunity. If you don't have any family silver to hawk, you know, you're still going to have the same opportunity. And that was the dream of everybody involved in that movement.
Yeah, you know, and she, you know, and she saw it on so many different levels, right? She sees it as economic, she sees it as social class, as a social class, right? And part of this is almost a Marxist demand, right? That, you know, it's class war, to keep women barefoot and pregnant, and to create this large labor force to, you know, pay a little bit of money to. And she also sees it as she sees it from a very modern sexual freedom, you know, that everybody should be able to enjoy their relationships sexually. Have one person enjoy sex and the other person be terrified that they're going to get pregnant.
Right. We actually kill you. Yeah.
You know, and she had like, and she's really interesting because she has all these affairs and she has like all these very, you know, she has all these lovers and she, all these, some of the letters that her lovers wrote her, my goodness, they are so romantic, you know. And, so she definitely had an appreciation of sexuality that was really ahead of her time in many ways, you know. So she's a fascinating person.
Well, Professor Scimeca, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you so much.
I enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope you invite me back. I would love to come again and talk about something else.
All right, we'll do it again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you.